So I was requested to respond on second thought again, and this time it's on socialism and innovation.
If you've ever wanted to learn about socialism, there's a good chance you've heard some version of this take before. You've probably been told something along the lines of, socialism does sound good in theory, but in practice, without the guiding hand of the profit motive, there would simply be no incentive to innovate.
That is true. However, that's not the reason why socialism is so catastrophic. The reality is the profits and losses are price signals. Now, what is the information of profits and losses? Profits and losses is information driven by the consumer. So the consumer, simply by walking into shops and picking up the goods that they want, they're handing it all at the counter and they're saying, these are the goods that we want you to go away and produce those goods. That's how producers know what to produce more and what not to produce. In other words, the goods that are not selling on the shelves, why would a producer want to sell or produce more of those types of products if they're not selling? That's the very reason why companies have market research departments. That should be common sense. Profits is information conveying to the market how much to produce. We also know what to produce more of because these are the products that are selling the most, and therefore we know what to produce more of, what resources we're going to use, therefore we know where we're going to allocate a specific resource into what given part of the market, because you've got to remember an entire nation. There isn't just one use of a said resource. There's all the various different kinds of uses for that wood. It might be used for producing beds, or it might be used for producing bedside cabinets, or it might be used for units or computer desks, and therefore it's got to reflect consumer demand, because if the consumer's demand isn't there, then what's the point, allocating a said resource into a part of the market where there's no demand there? This is why socialism was such a failure, because you saw in the likes of the Soviet Union, in every socialist regime that you've been faced with, you saw the economic calculation problem.
Sure, capitalism may have its flaws, but hey, at least it's good at innovating, and in the long run, that means most things will eventually be solved by the market. Socialism, on the other hand, means saying bye-bye to innovation.
Like I says, folk, you only have to look at Anthony C. Sutton's argument, especially the Soviet Union that got all of its technology for that of the West, and they were driving about in Ford Motors and all sorts. Those very special interest groups tended to favour that of the socialists. And you can actually watch, I think his name's Tick or whatever, and one of his particular videos you can go and check out, he even mentions about Anthony C. Sutton and how, of course, in his material from his books, he explains how these fascists would be the providers, the ones who would finance such regimes.
No innovation means no iPhone, and suddenly it's back to playing Brick Breaker on your mom's BlackBerry. You'd think that with such a simple yet crushing argument, there'd be no socialist to speak of. No countries run by communist parties. No postmodern cultural neo-Marxists taking over college campuses. No old men with magic bird powers. But the reality is that innovation is not only consistently stifled under capitalism, there is no reason to think it wouldn't flourish under socialism.
He seems to think that he's living in a capitalist system today. Your private sector, even from 1960s levels, is all regulated. If 1960s levels is all regulated, what the bloody hell do you call today? It's just like my previous video. In response to current affairs, it's this issue again, where government creates a problem through all of its intervention in the market, strangles the market half to death, as if by magic they somehow find a way to blame what government's caused, strangling the market through heavy government regulation, and then saying, oh look what capitalism caused.
In fact, there's plenty of evidence that it would. But before we get to that, let's briefly touch on innovation under our current system. No one disputes that capitalism has seen the birth of many, many discoveries. But a lot of that is at best only tangentially related to our current mode of production. Capitalist innovation is just not all that it's cracked up to be. And speaking of cracked, take the iPhone, the example of choice for those who defend our current economic model. The story goes that Steve Jobs, luminary genius that he was,
you're living in corporatism where your private sector's all regulated by the government. What you've got is a type of system where special interest groups have become so dominant over the market and there's barriers to entry into the market, and they're able to hold such a position because of what all the socialist government interventionism's caused, is that government picks and chooses winners and losers. Because government through its heavy regulation has set down all the barriers to entry into the market, smaller businesses have got no chance of competing against the giant corporations. They just can't, because it's not a free market. And he's sitting here trying to make it out as if it is some sort of a free market, as if that's the market's fault. That's the fault of government's intervention that's laid down the barriers in the first place that stopped the smaller businesses from competing with them.
Built Apple from the back of his garage to the front stage of America, producing innovation after innovation along the way. The fruit of his labor and superior intellect, along with his keen ability to respond to the demands of the market, produced the device you're probably watching this video on. Or so they'll say. To reject capitalism is therefore to reject this miracle of technology in your hand, and even so much as thinking to advocate for socialism on an Apple device makes you a hypocrite ripe for an Elon Musk Twitter takedown. Capitalism made your iPhone. You should be grateful and learn not to bite the hand that feeds you. But that perspective couldn't be further from reality. Not only did capitalism not make your iPhone, almost every single component that makes it a smartphone actually comes from state-directed innovation. Microprocessors, memory chips, solid-state hard drives, liquid crystal displays, lithium batteries, touchscreens. All of these were not invented by profit-seeking capitalists battling it out in the marketplace.
Right, focus. Like I says, in terms of individuals in any specific system, even when you talk about governments, what we're saying is that there's more chance of something being innovative or having a more innovative economy when people have the freedom to think. And that's what you've no got through a socialist system. Socialism's got no chance of avoiding totalitarian dictatorship. And that's that in a nutshell. It says, don't thank your government for your iPhone. It says, the very analysis which leads us asking the government to tax fund certain research is the very reason the government shouldn't be trying to on the results or whatever. Much chortling in economist circles at this tweet from Mariana, and she goes on and says that in specific, you can see there. He says, yes, I know, but the economists don't have much in the way of jokes. The laughter is because I can't even pronounce her name, is the economist who insists the government is responsible for innovation in the world of ours. Yes, that's right. The same government that took 4 months to notice a typo on a visa application, she argues, is the one which made the iPhone possible. She's written an entire book on the subject of the entrepreneurial state and is setting up an institute to propagate the idea. I'll probably leave the article with you and you can have a read through it yourself, because obviously it goes on and on. So like I mentioned, with government, it doesn't mean to say there can't be specific things, but typically, like I says, when people have got the freedom to think for themselves, then of course there's more chance you'll see innovation or what have you. Okay, we'll say that the chips or whatever were innovated by government, but does that mean to say that it was efficient? Again, we'll just go along with his argument on that in specific. Like I says, if you're living in some full-blown socialist economy, good luck with that one, because I'll tell you this, it'll all be done to the central government. People will be left as peasants.
But thanks to the funding and or direct involvement of governments in the creative process.
And funny enough, in that article, he did mention about that today with the whole thing today with government funding. Again, you can go and check that article out for yourself, and it contradicts what he's basically stating in that. That's why I say, do your independent research and look, and you'll find information or what have you. Even at that argument of what he's saying in terms of the profit seeking, it's actually because when competition is up against one another and there's the pressure for facing losses, businesses have an incentive to improve, and even up against competition, they're constantly under pressure to beat their competition. Whereas when you've got the absence of profits and losses, you need information of profits and losses. You need that pressure, you need that competition to incentivize improvement. You can forget about even trying to innovate to, provide for consumers, because that's out the question when it comes to socialism, because socialism is all about economic central planning, and you pretty much saw that with the internet anyway.
Same goes for the GPS, voice recognition software, cell networks, and HTTP and HTML protocols that together make an iPhone an iPhone. All of these things exist thanks to the innovation that happened without price signals, without market competition.
We'll take, again, that information for face value, because as far as I'm aware, the World Wide Web was innovated by that of the market, and that wasn't down to government.
And most importantly, without private capital. But that's not all. The internet itself, the most important thing that makes the smartphone smart and more than just a metal rectangle with pretty colors, is the fruit of government innovation.
It's like I've read in an article before by the Mises Institute. They touched upon how the internet was what was innovated. It was used for the military, but it was completely inefficient. It was actually the market that turned it into something efficient and useful and made it the World Wide Web that you know today.
The internet is arguably one of, if not the most life-changing innovation in the history of humanity.
The government never made that accessible to the consumers. The World Wide Web did. In fact, it's quite funny that is, because he's actually against all the centralisation. He's trying to create an internet 2.0, and basically that means something decentralised relative to daily capitalism. That's quite funny, that is. He's trying to make it sound as if it was government that did that. It wasn't government.
And governments are so good at innovating that they stumbled on the formula for it at least twice. Markets may have capitalized on these innovations, but that just doesn't count as innovation in and of itself. Selling something isn't the same as coming up with it. The reality of this device is that it took the concerted efforts of a public research apparatus to make the iPhone possible, not the self-interested greed of a few profiteers. And while the iPhone is a great example of this fact, it's by no means unique. This same story is repeated all throughout our society, including on much more important things than our Twitter machines. Most crucially, our medical industry is entirely reliant on the ability of the public sector to innovate.
Now, you've really put your foot in it there, because long before the NHS even existed, Scotland was the world leader of medicine and education. Scotland was basically the world leader of medicine and education at that time period. This was during a period when it wasn't even in the public sector. And yes, most of your, medical discoveries, the foundations of what was built, was created by the Scottish people. It was the Scottish people who taught the world that you must first cure the mind before you cure the body. All this stuff like penicillin, etc., all that was discovered because of individuals free to think for themselves. And it's like all this medical discovery that Scotland had, created. That's the very reason why you take, for example, prior to Scotland making all these sort of discoveries, you had about 40% chance of survival in terms of mothers giving birth, and it was because of Scotland that completely cleared that. I mean, you've now, what's the chances of a mother dying from giving birth? It's just very, very, very slim. The chances are very, very slim. This was long before any sort of NHS came around. The NHS didn't come around until 1948. Scotland had already discovered all these medical discoveries long before all that came around. So the idea that he's came up with is just erroneous, to say the least. This is not because of some public sector. It's because of the market, because people had the freedom to think for themselves. The reason why I mentioned about Scotland is because the rest of the world followed after us. That when it came to the late 18th century, the whole of Europe had turned to Scotland. They looked to us for, so many things. As Voltaire once, quoted saying, we look to Scotland for all our ideas of civilization. Even boatloads of what would become Americans were sent off in boatloads to Scotland to gain their medical education, following after those medical discoveries and influence people to then have that blueprint to then improve. And saying that Scotland gained that because of some government is just laughable, to say the least, because if that was the case, then explain to me how Scotland wasn't able to do that prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the Scottish Enlightenment. A large part of John Knox foundations, and again, I don't mean to get into all of this, but opposed at that time to do with the Catholic Church and stuff like that. And at the time period, there was this combination between church and state, and you had feudalism, you had, theocracy and what have you in that time period. Head of the state was that of the Scottish Kirk, that being St Giles Cathedral, which of course you can actually go and visit today, which is not actually that far off of, Edinburgh Castle. It's on the Royal Mile. You never had the freedom to freely read or write. That was prohibited. This is why I'm mentioning about John Knox, because John Knox was revolutionary in the sense that he would give people, if they obeyed by his, rules or what have you, then of course you were granted the freedom to freely speak to God, and through bread, wine, what have you, he gave people the freedom to freely read and write. When things reverted back to John Knox's way of thinking by the early 18th century, then of course what you saw was the eventual rise of the Scottish Enlightenment. That is to say that the very reason why the likes of Adam Smith, Robert Burns, Robert Louis Stevenson, Sir Walter Scott, and so many Scots had come out from the Scottish Enlightenment, it wasn't as if by magic because we're just some sort of magical people. It's actually because it just happened to be that we were a country that became free at that point, well, somewhat free, right? If you were to compare the 1600s, in other words, the 17th century, to the 18th century, then yes, there was a certain transition moving away from that feudal period. Over the course of a century, you would see in the gradual move to the Industrial Revolution, that change is what led to specifically that. So that's why the Scottish Enlightenment had came around. You take, for example, Robert Burns. Robert Burns was homeschooled by his own father. If by his logic of what I'm trying to say to you is, if his logic stood to reason, why then was Scotland not so innovative in all of its medical discovery? After all, it's all thanks to Scotland, the world leaders of medicine back then, and even today Scotland is the world leader of medicine. If Scotland is the world leader of medicine and wasn't the world leader of medicine then, how come Scotland wasn't that in the 17th century and even prior to that time period? And we're talking about the 17th century, we're talking about the 1600s. When of course church and state was head and St Giles Cathedral ruled, and you saw even the young boy Thomas Aikenhead, as I mentioned before, who was hung at the gallows in 1697 or something. The reason for why Scotland became such an influence to the rest of the world and how it became so innovative and why the Industrial Revolution came around was because they had more freedom to do so. Why was there no Industrial Revolution prior to all of that? I mean, you had plenty of centuries, millennia in fact, to go through, thousands of years, going all the way back to the ancient, Rome, more than 2,000 years ago. The whole of Europe turned to Scotland for all their ideas of civilization. They were reading books from Scotland. It wasn't a case that they were reading from the German Enlightenment or the French Enlightenment, which was influential to its own extent. Scotland didn't become that influential because, well, it's just Scotland. Well, maybe you could make that argument, but largely where it's come from is the liberty for them to freely think and do for themselves. Again, I'm not having a go. I understand that people are Catholic and all the rest of it, and I don't care about all that, because, I've got nothing against people who are Catholic and all the rest of it, right? The Catholic Church, of what ruled over Scotland at that time. I'm not saying this is down to the fault of Catholicism, right? I'm just saying of what was at that time period. It prohibited people from freely reading and writing. And as a result of prohibiting people freely reading and writing, that's why the Scottish Enlightenment did not take place then and happened afterwards.
One study found that NIH funding was associated directly or indirectly with every drug approved from 2010 to 2016. Without publicly funded research, aka not the kind that follows market fluctuations, we wouldn't have made nearly all the medical advancements we have, or saved nearly as many lives.
Again, folk, is contradicted by Scotland. I want to tell you a simple fact, folk. This is why Scotland can proudly boast of being such a significant nation. If you were to tally up every single life lost in all wars and battles that have ever faced the entire planet Earth's history, take every war and battle that you've ever known to face planet Earth's history, you tally up every single life that's been lost in all of them put together, it doesn't even come a fraction close to the quantity of lives that Scotland has saved. And that's the very reason, and that's the very meaning behind the saying, the Brits may have ruled the earth, but the Scots populated it. The world was our oyster. That's what that means. It's not meaning that Scotland bred and somehow everybody's got Scottish heritage. It just simply means that thanks to Scotland and all of these medical discoveries, etc., that laid the blueprint, that laid the foundations, that did and achieved all that wasn't achieved by some government folk. That was achieved through the market, through people having the freedom to think for themselves.
These are not innovations that make public researchers multimillionaires, nor that have a good ROI, and yet they are the bedrock of our modern health system. Some innovations that support the capitalist economy,
again, it's not a capitalist economy, it's corporatism,
even come from completely voluntary, non-government funded, and entirely unpaid work done by brilliant people who just wanted to do something one day and did. Companies like Facebook, Airbnb, and Netflix all rely on thousands and thousands of lines of open source code.
Individuals who came up with the open source is part of the market. That's part of a free-thinking people, and he says non-government funded. It came from the market. That's still the market. That these people don't even understand what a market is. Even if it was somebody that didn't do it for the sake of profit, it's still been done by the market. It's still been done by individuals that are free to think for themselves and do what they please. If you were living under socialism, you'd be living like North Korea. You wouldn't have freedom. You wouldn't have the freedom to do any of that. You wouldn't be allowed. Therefore, that freedom came as a result of capitalism. That's how they were able to freely think for themselves and do stuff like, innovate and, create things like the open source. That's capitalism. That free and voluntary exchange, all that charitable operations that you see in the economy, that's capitalism. That's got nothing to do with socialism. What's he going about?
Published freely and with no expectation of compensation by random, passionate programmers. These companies are so dependent on this free, voluntary, very uncapitalist code that back in 2016, an open source programmer unpublished just 11 lines of code, and most major websites you can think of just started crashing. But it's not just that many of capitalism's so-called innovations aren't even the fruit of capitalist forces. There's a whole other, more problematic side to our modern economy. Capitalism actively hinders innovation. There are a couple reasons behind this, but for starters, capitalism naturally tends towards monopolies. It's just what happens in a winner-takes-all competition.
Never in recorded history has a monopoly ever stemmed as a result of a free market. Number 2, you do not live in a free market economy, therefore you don't live in a capitalist system. Number 3, Microsoft and the likes of Google and all these big tech companies are not a monopoly. Mono, meaning singular, means that you would have to own the market 100% share. In other words, you would have no competition whatsoever. And they don't seem to want to let go of Google, and that's it. You just have to respect what the consumer wants. If the consumer wants to be spied on, then it's up to them. There's nothing stopping consumers going onto a search engine like Google, searching up another browser, and then downloading that, and then stop using Google and delete Google. Hint, hint. It's just like how they went on about all these so-called monopolies in the late 19th century. And I'm not going on to that argument again, folk. He can't point out to you anywhere where a market has led to a monopoly. All these monopolies came around because of government and government's intervention through the regulation.
Eventually, the winners do take all, and they consolidate or form cartels. In the absence of competition, large industries can reliably secure profits without needing to do very much beyond periodically making small improvements to their products.
Did you hear that, folk? That's a big concession he just says there, and he doesn't even realise it. He says, in the absence of competition, then of course they can, gain all these profits and do whatever the hell they like, exactly. And why is that competition being eliminated? is because of government's intervention via socialism.
With that one sentence, I've just described to you the entire innovation strategy behind every Apple product. And don't get mad, I say that as an Apple guy. The reality is that if the only motivation for innovation is profit, and that truly is the only one capitalism has to offer, once you take that variable out of the equation, there is no reason to innovate anymore.
And the reality is, if you were to open up the free market and you had fierce competition and there's no longer barriers to entry into the market, someone you don't even know will come out of nowhere and come up with something better than the iPhone, and they'll end up creating something that's a big threat, and it'll force Apple to change and adapt and improve.
But even in the fantasy world defenders of capitalism live in, where monopolies do not naturally come to dominate the economy, capitalism is still rife with problems that make innovation grind to a halt. Generally speaking, capitalism only promotes and actively incentivizes innovation that turns a profit.
You do realise that in order for somebody to drive a profit, they need to benefit consumers in the first place, satisfy consumers' needs and wants in order to gain a profit. That's what profits are. It's not just a case of just saying, oh well, a profit is something that's just a surplus, you fill your own pockets with it, and that's it.
Any innovation, no matter how grand, no matter how many millions of lives it could save, only sees the light of day if it can provide a good return on investment. If something is good for a very large number of people, but they all happen to be poor, too bad. It's just not gonna happen.
The only way a company is going to benefit a great many people and create something and gain a profit in the first place is if they're going to make sales. So a great many people must be spending on that good. The reason why they're able to sell the iPhone, and even at a specific given price, is because a lot of people are buying it. What he just basically says there was like, oh well, you know, it's a large scale demand of people, but most of them can't even afford it. That would then force the company with no other option but to reduce the price so that they can sell it and get rid of it, if that was the case.
While I'm sure there are technical problems that make that difficult, manufacturers would be putting a lot more effort into solving that puzzle if it wasn't so profitable to have bad batteries you'll need to replace with a new purchase every couple of years. What incentive does Apple have to sell you one iPhone when it could sell you 5? Capitalism does not reward those who produce the best products. It rewards those that produce the cheapest and most profitable stuff.
As a result of the profit and loss motive and everything like that, what you've saw is a vast improvement over the years from Apple, especially with the M1 chipset.
Regardless if it achieves that with a worse product or dirt poor wages. But it doesn't end there. Another big failure of the capitalist model of innovation is the conflict over information. In the quest to find new ways to compete, capitalists are happy to shoot themselves in the foot and take our society along with them, so long as it means they keep the upper hand over their competitors. Relative profits matter a lot more than absolute profits. So what's bad for the industry is only a problem if it upsets its internal power dynamics.
Again, folk, he doesn't even understand profits. Profits is the information that tells you the information of where to allocate resources, etc. See, if you throw profits out the window, you've no longer got the information of where you're going to allocate said scarce resources. Like I said, with the variety of different scarce resources and all the variety of different uses you've got with them, I'm not going to go into that because you can check out my video I've done on the variety of uses on the economic calculation problem. You can go and check it out for yourself. But in a nutshell, you're not going to hoard all that information if you've not got the information of profits and losses.
Regardless if it achieves that with a worse product or dirt poor wages. But it doesn't end there. Another big failure of the capitalist model of innovation is the conflict over information. In the quest to find new ways to compete, capitalists are happy to shoot themselves in the foot and take our society along with them, so long as it means they keep the upper hand over their competitors. Relative profits matter a lot more than absolute profits. So what's bad for the industry is only a problem if it upsets its internal power dynamics. In theory, every firm should normally benefit from a database cataloging the discoveries made by everyone else in their search for new innovations, allowing everyone to build on the discoveries others make. If being the most innovative we can be is the goal, there's no reason to have secrets that someone else could use to make something you care about even better. But every firm knows that sharing its proprietary information could hurt its bottom line, even though the outcome for customers would be a better product. It's better to sit on a discovery you don't know how to harness yet and might never figure out, than to let your competitor swoop in and get there before you. Even though we would all benefit from innovation happening faster and letting information find the person who's going to utilize it best, capitalism is incredibly inefficient when it comes to doing so just because it's a safer way to make money. Despite capitalists always referring to the so-called free market, information has no freedom of movement, and it gets heavily restricted to avoid hurting each individual firm's bottom line. Patents are some of the more extreme examples of this kind of restricted flow of information.
So here we go with the patents. Now, I've mentioned before something to do with intellectual property, and that's something to do with government and government's intervention where it sets down a specific law and punishes people. Now, certain people will agree with the intellectual property being protected and what have you, in government setting down such a law or whatever, but it's government that punishes people. That's nothing to do with the market. Anyway, folk, if you've got anything you would like to add in, if you've got anything maybe you would want to provide, such as articles or that, feel free to share it with us. Maybe you've got stuff on the issue to do with the technology. Maybe I could provide it in another video or what have you. It's not something I've really looked into, to be perfectly honest with you. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but even that one particular article which I'll share in the description area, for what I saw there, it contradicts his narrative in terms of government funding, what have you. So there you go, that's all I need to say. Like I say, anything you'd like to add in, just share in the comment section below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.